faith, family, business, adventure. This is the Phoenix Podcast with KenSharpe.
Welcome to the Phoenix Podcast with Kenneth Sharpe. And today on our program, I'm privileged to showcase the stories that matter, people who rise from the ashes. And we have as our special guest today, John Chikura. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you for joining us. And a little bit of introduction to John. I met him at the CEO Zimbabwe Network Conference in Victoria Falls just over a week ago. He was a special speaker, and I was really touched by what he said. He's a man of ethics, a man of moral fiber, a man of great character, and he has an interesting story to tell us today. He was the CEO of the Deposit Protection Corporation, which he founded and set up and ran for 15 years. And he's been a man in many businesses, in many industries, and we're excited to hear from him. So without further ado, John, tell us, what got you into the Deposit Protection Corporation?
Well, the government and the central bank had witnessed the failure of two banks within the country. And the experiences were daunting because no depositor was reimbursed at all of the money that they had in the banks that failed. You probably remember United Merchant Bank and Universal Merchant Bank. When they failed, government could not reimburse the depositors their funds back, and there was no organization in place to do that. So the government decided that they would create an organization, and they requested the central bank to create such an organization, and the central bank recruited me to found this organization, and I ran it from 2003 when it started to when I retired in 2018.
A lot must have happened in that period. From the time you started, I guess the environment was more stable, both in terms of currency, in terms of inflation. And at your end of your tenure, I can imagine it was completely chaotic with hyperinflation. So tell us a bit about your experiences, the good and the bad.
It's interesting you mentioned that because we were created in chaos. The principles of deposit insurance say you don't create a deposit insurance organization unless and until you stabilize the financial services sector first. In other words, you strengthen supervision, you strengthen the institutions within the banking sector, and then you create the Deposit Protection Corporation. But that was not the case in Zimbabwe. The reason for that is that the house was on fire already, seeing banks failing and depositors losing their money. They couldn't wait. So they said, let's create it now. If you remember, in 2003, things were going bad already. As we started 2004, I came to the central bank to start off the deposit protection in August of 2003. And Governor Gono came in December of the same year. And in 2004, 6 banks went under. So we were born in a crisis, if you want.
And those 6 banks that went under, did people lose money?
Yes, people lost money, but because the central bank had created an organization to protect depositors' funds, we were able to reimburse depositors their funds. Those that were not reimbursed by the initial payment that the organization makes were then reimbursed through the process of liquidation. In other words, you start selling the assets of the organization. When you sell the organization, you pay dividends to the depositors who had their money in the bank, which was not reimbursed.
So I believe you were both the CEO of the organization, the liquidator, and the judicial manager.
That's correct.
And tell us, how did it feel to have so much authority, and how did you discharge your duties in a way that was both responsible, ethical, but also practical?
It was a challenge. To begin with, we faced the situation where the capacity of the organization was not there, because we were just creating the organization. Before we finished creating and started collecting premiums from the banks started fading. So A, we didn't have funds in the kitty, and B, we didn't have the skills that we needed because we had not built up the capacity yet. So we had challenges from that angle. And we then ensured that we deal with the challenges that were arising at that point in time by outsourcing. And we went to the accounting firms in the country and asked them to be our agent, and we supervised them in liquidating banks. So that's how we managed.
What would be the biggest challenge you had during that period and leading up to hyperinflation? What would you say was something that was beyond your control?
Well, when you talk of the establishment of an organization of that nature, one of the problems was that the banks themselves saw it as a burden. They looked at it as a form of tax by government to hit them. And in other words, they didn't believe we needed such an organization.
Right.
Because in many countries, the government comes to rescue depositors in a bank if a bank fails. Clear cases in South Africa. If you look at their case, some of the banks that we know today were created out of failing banks by the government coming to rescue them and then doing those banks in a different format, merging them, if you want, with stronger banks to become what they are today. But that sort of thing could not happen here because the economy was also a challenge in itself. The funding was not available. Government didn't have the funding. So the challenges were quite significant. Yeah.
And hyperinflation, how did people's money get lost? We know that if we go back to 2018, if we look at the banks collapse and the dollarization of the economy thereafter, there was nothing really left in the banks. So I believe it was $28 million that the banks restarted with. So what happened to all those savings, and why was there not enough protection from either your organization or from the government to assist in making sure that people didn't lose their pensions and their savings?
That was one of the questions that the public was raising to me. We've lost our money. If you remember, zeros were taken out a number of times. If you had $1 million and 3 zeros are taken, what have you got? If 6 zeros are taken out, you remain with $1, you know. And people were saying, but what's the purpose of your organization if these things are happening and you are not protecting us? But one needs to remember that the government was doing laws to effect those changes. And therefore, what Parliament has introduced or legislated, I couldn't be the protector against the depositors because those were laws of the country of the government of the day. You can't then say to government, don't do this, when their Parliament is legislating to do certain things. In other words, the protection I was affording was where a bank fails in a natural way. That the bank itself is failing as a result of poor corporate governance, poor strategic management, poor risk management, or the bank's doing certain things that precipitates the failure. But not where government comes in and say, this is the direction we're taking. We couldn't protect against those. But that was a real challenge because people lost their money. That's a reality. That's the reason why a lot of people have no confidence in the current currency of the country because they've bent their fingers along the way a number of times.
It's really disappointing. And I remember back in 2010, we had borrowed some money. In our business today, we don't have any debt. Right. And one of the reasons why we don't have any debt is I'm very scared of debt. Right. Because debt is fine when things are going well, but when the economy takes a turn south, debt can be very expensive and it can actually destroy a business. And we had two banks. I don't know if I can name them on this program, but I will. Kingdom Bank was one and the other was Tetrad. Right. And there were significant amounts in Zim dollars. The one was 4 million, the other was 3 million. And at that time, the exchange rate was, hadn't yet reached the levels that it is now. It was almost on a one-to-one basis. It was a real currency. Sure. So when we took a decision, it was difficult for us to repay those banks. But we took a decision morally. The right thing to do was to repay them as soon as possible. Okay. And we actually liquidated assets and into cash and repaid both the banks in full. Right. So we know we delivered real value to those banks. And my hope, maybe it was a wishful hope, but my hope was that this would help save the bank, because at least, you know, a significant amount has come back to the bank. But then I look back now at the history of those banks, and it didn't really help them. It almost didn't touch sides. Both of those banks ended up collapsing. What is the reason for that? What do you think? And I know that you left in 2018, but going back to an earlier period, let's say between 2010 and 2016, during that hyperinflation period, after the hyperinflation period, we're now operating in dollars. How did it happen that such a situation can take place where the bank doesn't have enough assets to cover their depositors?
It depends on what the banks do with the deposits they get from the public. Because the principle in banking is that you actually match your liabilities with the assets. If you fail to do that, you probably find yourself having liability that requires liquidity, and you have assets that are difficult to sell in the short term, and therefore you don't have the money when depositors demand them, and it's not there, it's not available. So the banks found themselves quite in a difficult situation. I must say that situation also affected the Deposit Protection Corporation. When we went into dollarization in 2009, beginning of 2009, we had accumulated a fund within the Deposit Protection Corporation, which was a sizable fund. But when dollarization came, we found that we didn't have anything because we were wiped out. You won't believe it if I tell you that we remained with $4,000.
4,000 US dollars.
4,000 US.
From millions, hundreds of millions?
Exactly. And that situation affected also the banks. They found themselves in a startup organization, right, like everybody else.
So their capital was completely wiped out.
Yeah, and I may tell you as well that I was involved in liquidating those two banks you are talking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you'll recall then that when those banks were liquidated, and I'm sure there are other examples of other banks, it was now a US dollar era. We'd moved from the 2008 hyperinflation, dollarization in February 2009, and we started trading in dollars. So in dollars, for me, it's a simple thing that if you have assets on the one side and liabilities on the other, sure, you can have a mismatch in cash flow and having the liquidity to fund a run on the bank. But once it gets into your hands as a liquidator or judicial manager, if the assets are quality and you can realize the value from those assets, then surely they should be at least matching the depositors.
But you need to also take into account the changes that come from government in terms of policy shifts. For example, we had the US dollar up to 2019, and the government then says it's 1-to-1.
Right.
You know, nobody is spared. Everybody is caught up in that situation. If you had some US dollar, you didn't have a US dollar, you were now having local currency. And the local currency, if I remember correctly, the exchange rate started at $2.50. Where is it today?
1,000.
And that situation only helps people who are borrowers, not the creditors.
Right.
Because if you borrowed 100 million then before 2019, and you didn't pay back a cent, and you now have to pay back today, and the exchange rate is 1,000 USD, how much are you paying back?
100,000. So you make 100 million profit.
But what's the situation with the lender?
Someone loses. They lose.
Exactly.
Right. So if we could say the main problem in the fundamentals of the banking crisis in Zimbabwe is the regulatory climate and framework that government puts in place that perhaps changes too often. And those changes that happen cause a disruption and instability and could lead to a collapse, which has happened in the many cases of the banks.
I would say it is both. Policy shifts, policy changes like some of these that we are talking about, and also failure on the part of bank management and the governance of the board itself.
All right.
I'll give you an example. When Trust Bank failed in 2004, I don't know whether you're aware that in their 6 months results, Trust Bank was neck to neck in terms of size with Standard Bank, which was the biggest bank in the country then.
I didn't know that.
If they'd gone to December that year, Trust Bank would have emerged as the biggest bank in the country.
Incredible.
But they failed, you know, in the middle of the year. And why did they fail? If you remember, because of the threat of inflation, exactly the worry that you're talking about, they decided to buy motor vehicles with those deposits they were getting and borrowings they were making. They decided to buy bricks. In other words, all the produce of the brick makers, they paid for them and said, we're going to sell the bricks ourselves now. But they were moving away from the core banking business to a speculative, position,
Right.
where they were acting as speculators in the market, speculating with cars, speculating with the bricks. At the end of the day, are you matching your liabilities with your assets? Not at all. So their governance as well, in terms of governance. The banking sector, if you look at the history of many banks that failed, the blame lies with the boards and the management in terms of ethical behavior, in terms of good governance behavior. It was not there.
So if we put it down to one word, for me, what I'm hearing is responsibility. Responsibility from the regulator, responsibility from the board and management to look after people's money. It's as simple as that, John.
Exactly.
And looking at the environment today, what is different? Why do people still not trusting the banks today? We've now moved from a dollarized economy back to a RTGS, if I can call it a mixed basket currency environment where US dollars are still fully legal tender in Zimbabwe, and the banks can take US dollar deposits, but people seem to be afraid of putting their money in the banks. Why is this?
Well, if I take you back again to to yesteryear, if you remember, Ken, when we grew up, our parents and ourselves for our children, we were getting policies for the education of our children. We were paying for them and hoping that when the child starts going to school, I'm not going to be paying the fees. The fees are coming back from the policy that I've paid for them. We had endowment policies for our own lives, life policies, etc. We had pensions. Are these things still there? Did these things materialize in terms of giving us benefits? Not at all. We lost them all. And then come this dollarization period you're talking about and the hyperinflation. We lost all the funds we had in the banks. And at the end of the day, they say, once bitten, twice shy.
Yeah.
And one of the singers, I'm forgetting the name now, says, the first cut is the deepest. So people remember what happened to them yesterday. Some of them no more have a cent coming to their pockets in terms of pension because there's nothing. Those pension organizations are not there. The facilities are not there. That's the reason why.
I hear you. So it's a matter of trust. Trust has been broken,
Exactly.
and to repair trust is very difficult. It's like a piece of string. Once it's broken, it's so hard to tie those strands back together. But I want to come back to this subject because it's a more philosophical one, and it's about hope in the future. And I believe our young people who are listening to this program today need to understand that it's important to invest in your future. Because if you don't set aside the capital and save the money, our country cannot grow, because without the capital base, without the formal markets, without schemes like the Deposit Protection Corporation, it's very difficult for us to regrow the economy on a substantial sustainative basis. So just to go back in time, before you went to the Deposit Protection Corporation, I believe you were in insurance, and before that mining, and before that you were working in all kinds of different jobs. I've been told you were even a mechanic, a spanner boy at one stage. At one stage you were a bus conductor. Tell us about some of your working experiences and take us back in time.
Well, Ken, it's a long history, if you want. When I finished my primary education, my parents could not afford to take me to secondary school. So I remained home, and I left home.
Where were you living, John? Maybe tell us about where you were born.
In the rural areas in
Right.
Nyazura.
In Nyazura.
Yeah, Rusape district.
You come from which area? What is your totem?
My totem is Nyati,
Nyati.
and we come from an area called Nyangombe or Maveja. I schooled at Maveja School, actually, in the rural areas. So when my colleagues went to secondary school, I remained home looking after cattle and goats at home, because my parents could not afford to send me to school. And I decided to go and look for a job, and started working in Rusape at 15 years of age.
You were 15 years of age.
I was 15 years old.
Incredible.
And I did all sorts of jobs at that level. You know, Ken, you remind me of a time when one of the jobs I did there was working for GMB. And if you remember GMB, the bags, maize bags or whatever, they were not 50 kgs as we know them today. They were 90 kg bags.
That's one way to get you strong.
And, you know, the older folks would get into the railway truck or the lorry where you're offloading, and they needed the youngsters to be under, so they can throw the bag on your head. And as they throw it, they say, "Wakawaya wega." You came on your own. You came
Punishment.
on your own. You know. But I did those jobs. I was a lorry boy. I was a spanner boy. You know. I did all sorts of jobs at that point in time, Ken, because I couldn't go to school further. Then I realized that life could be better, but I now had to marry, because what else do you do? You're not going to school, you're now working, you've got a cent in your pocket, $1 in your pocket. What do? Marry and raise a family. And when I raised my family, the children were starting to go to school, and I realized I also needed to go to school. So I couldn't leave working, and I was in industry then on the shop floor working. And I continued working, reading at night, and that's how I educated myself. And I read on my own from where I'd left primary school to
Primary school.
Yes.
So you were basically going through school with your children.
Yes, and I read on my own up to MBA level. And I did my MBA with Manchester University.
That is amazing.
In the UK, but I was reading from here. I went to Manchester University for the graduation.
So you're an MBA graduate.
Yes.
And you didn't finish junior school.
Yes.
That's an incredible story, John.
Yes.
And how old were you when you went back to school? How old were you when your children were born?
Oh, la 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 la. Maybe 25, 26.
Mid-20s.
Yeah, mid-20s.
So for almost 10 years, you'd given up on education,
Yes.
been working hard, slaving away every day, saving money. And what was it that drove you back to go to school?
Well, it was the realization that life could be better than what it was. And when I saw others doing well who had gone to school, I didn't feel there was a limit. I didn't feel that it was too late for me to educate myself and take myself to where others were. And that was the motivation.
So you're motivated by improving yourself and by not giving up. Even though you were now in your mid-20s, you should have finished school at 18. It's never too late to go back and start again, right?
Not at all.
And I believe you also did a CIS. Is that
Yes,
right?
I did, before my MBA.
So you're quite a well-educated man, and you've come from not having any help from your parents. Do you think that's a good thing?
Well, if circumstances are such that you can't go to school in the normal way like anybody else, I don't think people should feel that there are limitations to their education. If that's what they want to achieve, they can still achieve it. You probably remember one of the motivators wrote that whatever the mind of man can conceive, it can achieve. So it's possible.
That's a good philosophy. You know, I often say in my own life, I look at the glass half full or half empty. You choose what you want to see. And I like to see it half full. In fact, I like to see it overflowing, because even if you can only see the glass half full, I believe the Lord's grace covers the other half that's not full. So coming back to the upbringing of children, and in my own life, I look back at my life, and my father didn't give me much help. He sent me to England on a one-way ticket when I was 17 with £100 in my pocket, and everything that I have I've built on my own. And I read a book. I was studying at Harvard. I graduated from Harvard last year, and I was studying. One of the professors there wrote a book called The Innovators Dilemma.
Congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. Again, I dropped out of school and didn't expect ever to get to Harvard. But the professor is Clayton Christensen, and he wrote a book called The Innovators Dilemma. And I often say it, that in his latter life, he got cancer, and he started writing more on life and philosophy, and he wrote a book called How You'll Measure Your Life. And in that book, he says, it's not what you do for your children that makes them, but what you don't do for them.
Okay.
Would you agree with that philosophy?
Yes, I do.
And how do you relate to that in your own life? I mean, your parents didn't pay for your education. Did you regret that? Were you bitter about it? How did you address that in your own mind emotionally?
Some family members in my family who didn't go to school in a similar way, because some of my uncles had been to school, St. Faith, doing secondary education. One of them was in South Africa. One of them stopped doing medicine at University of Zimbabwe because of political activism. They were kicked out of the university, but he had gone to school. So some family members who didn't, like me, were very bitter with parents saying that, these guys educated some, but they couldn't educate me. But I look at it differently, very differently, because I don't think it was deliberate on their part. At the time they sent others to school, they were capable of doing that. They had the means to do that.
Right.
But by the time some of us went to school, they could no longer afford it. They could no longer do it. Instead of being bitter about them, I appreciate what they did for me to give me that primary education. Because I launched off from there, and I needed that primary education to get to where I am today. So I'm grateful that they did what they could. I had to launch off from where they left me. At the end of the day, that's how I look at it, at life.
So it's about appreciating the little that you have,
yes,
and making good use of it and taking advantage of it.
Yes.
And in your
perhaps I could go back to the questions that you raised earlier, which
yes,
I
please,
didn't
about your working
commented
experience.
about
yes,
the working
yes,
experience.
Take us back there.
That I was in the retail business to begin with. That's when I started moving from the shop floor to the office. I worked for Tedco Management. Actually, one of the shops I worked for was in Stanley Avenue, which is now Jason Moyo. 54 Stanley Avenue. I was working there. From retail, I moved within retail, I moved to H.M. Baba's. And at that point in time, if you recall, blacks were not allowed to buy in H.M. Baba's.
Not allowed to shop in the...
Not allowed to shop in there. And we were some of the first black clerks admitted in the system at H.M. Baba's to work there. And I worked for H.M. Baba's in the office. And then I moved to cabs, banking sector. And I started off as a teller on the bank teller, and then moved on to investments. And then moved from there, I went to mining industry. That's when I joined Lonro Mining. And from here, I went to Mazoe Mine, where I was the mine secretary. I was assistant mine secretary at Mazoe, then promoted later on to mine secretary, Muriel Mine. Mine secretary is finance and admin manager, for the mine. And after I left Lonro, after some 6-7 years, I then moved to Clough Resources. Mr. J.G. Clough was the first major investor coming into independent Zimbabwe.
He was British, right?
He was British, that's correct. He then started Clough Resources Mine, and I was involved in setting up Frida Rebecca Mine.
In the beginning?
In the
That's
beginning.
in Bindura?
In Bindura. We were operating from Karigamombe Center, 14th floor Karigamombe Center. But I was the first one to be pushed out of the office to go to the mine itself. And I went to the mine, and my first job at the mine, apart from the technical guys who were doing the mining itself, starting to prepare. My first job was where the shaft is today was a cemetery. Was to move people from the cemetery. We woke them up and told them that you're sleeping on money. The country requires the money. Sorry, can we wake you up?
Is that allowed?
It's allowed. In fact, we did it with government's involvement.
So the Minerals Act takes precedence to the dead?
Well, we had the police, we had the district administrator, we had the provincial administrator, we had the radio, we had the TV, we were everywhere because we advertised for the relatives who buried their people there to come forward and work with us. We were going to fund the process, but we needed them there as relatives of the deceased to work with us.
Quite a painful. How long did that take?
Do I remember now? I think it was about a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you relocated all the graves?
We relocated all the graves. Where the mine is today,
right.
there are no graves.
And how many people?
153 graves.
Incredible.
Yeah.
That's quite a story, John.
Yeah. So after working for Clough Resources and getting involved in setting it up, by the time I left, about 6-7 years later, the organization was listed. We had listed it on the stock market. And I left them to join a startup organization again, Southern Africa Reinsurance. I don't know whether you remember that.
I think I heard about
it. It's called
it.
SARE, Southern Africa Reinsurance.
Yes.
In the reinsurance sector. We were starting again from scratch. And by the time I left, 7 years, coming to Deposit Protection Corporation, we had listed the organization on the stock market. And that's when I moved to the central bank to set up the Deposit Protection Corporation. So for my sins, if you want, I've been busy creating organizations for other people, but not for myself.
So you didn't take any gain from these companies? You never had a shareholding?
Not at all.
No personal profit?
Not at all.
What made you keep your moral, ethical code of conduct so clean? What was it that drove you all these years?
Well, at the end of the day, it's a matter of integrity. If you say, yes, I'm going to do this, you need to ensure that you do that. In my view, a good name is much more valuable than money, than gold. If I can have a bankable name, I prefer that than having dollars in the bank.
I respect that greatly, John. And to our younger audience today, where the value system has been eroded in our culture, Western culture has really bombarded us and frustrated us and confused us. Our youth today are so, I think, difficult for them in the modern world of technology, where they have so many distractions, so many temptations to take a shortcut. What is your guidance to them? What is your advice to them? Speak to the audience today.
My advice is that no matter how complicated your means of making money is, whether it's technology or otherwise, money can only be made in one way: a genuine exchange of goods and services. In other words, if you say to God, God, I'm praying that you give me money, and God says to you, but what do you give in return? How would you answer that question? If you say, I have nothing to give you, then you are a thief. You want to steal. You want to get what is not yours and not give nothing in return. But if you say to God, but I'm going to give my sweat, I'm going to give goods, I'm going to give services, which is your sweat, why would you not have what you're asking for? That's different. Now, it's also the same, these get-rich-quick schemes can really don't work. There is a saying that it takes 9 months to produce a baby. No matter how many men you may put on the job, it will still take 9 months. So at the end of the day, it pays, even if you take a longer route, an ethical route, a route of integrity, good governance, even personal governance applies. You still get to where you want to get. Remember I said, whatever the mind of man, that's Napoleon Hill, by the way, who wrote that book. whatever the mind of man can conceive, it can achieve. But you have to be genuine, that you're doing honest business. You are a person of integrity. You don't take something that is not yours. You don't rob someone of his, possessions. You will still succeed.
Thank you for those principles of truth that stand the test of time, John. You mentioned something about having an idea and being positive. What is your philosophy in life, and how do you speak to the youth today to look at what they have, being grateful for it? Give us some wisdom here, some golden nuggets.
Well, my philosophy is to agree fully with that saying that goes like, Rome was not built in a day. When you look at Rome today, you say to yourself, wow, how I wish we could have this in Zimbabwe. But we may have that, not today, not tomorrow, but later, depending on what we're doing. So you start off without. You build it up slowly, slowly, slowly. You'll get to where you want to get. There's also an English saying that says that easy come, easy go. So if I'm going to steal today to amass some wealth, it will go in the same way it came.
Yeah, true.
So at the end of the day, it's not worth it. Corruption doesn't pay anyone. Some people may think that they're gaining. Look, Ken, we have hospitals that when you need blood, when you need medicine, you ask it to go and buy and bring these things yourself. Am I right? But some people are fattening their pockets from doing corrupt things, and they have lots of money. But assume you are hit on the road in what's 2nd Street. As you step out of this building, you get an accident there. Which hospital are you going to be taken to?
Yeah.
The same hospitals that are empty.
Yeah.
So where is the benefit? Who is benefiting? It's a zero-sum game.
So it comes back to what you were saying, integrity. Exactly. We've got a few minutes left, and I wanted you to share with us your experience in governance, in corporate governance. I believe you actually worked with the famous King, who wrote a lot of books on governance. What is your feeling today in how the youth should be looking at governance? We've heard ESG as a popular term. Environment governance issues are being talked about all the time.
Governance, Ken, is about corporations being responsible, taking care of the environment in which they are operating, taking care of the social needs of the community they are operating in, and ensuring that they secure a future for our progeny going forward. So good governance is about being a good corporate citizen. You can't make money at the expense of the community that you're operating from, because society gives you a license to operate by allowing you to run your company within itself. And that license can be withdrawn by society if they feel that you are now harming them. So governance is about ensuring that your own personal governance is right, the governance of your corporation is right, you take the environment into account, you take the social needs of the community into account, and you ensure that you're not harming the future for those that are coming after us.
So powerful, John. Sustainability, ESG, we've heard about these terms being talked about. We know that our society depends on the world, thinking about the planet and the people more than profit. And you're one of those men who is mature, who has wisdom, and yet is really preaching what you practice. It's been a pleasure having you on this program today. Finally, tell us in one word or one sentence, John, if you wanted to be remembered by something, what would it be?
I think it's the work that I've done in the area of corporate governance. I have trained in corporate governance for the World Bank, for the Commonwealth, for SADC in the region, the Institute of Directors here, CIS that you were talking about. I've done a lot of work, and I think it's something that I will be remembered for.
Thank you, John. Remember that governance, young people out there. This is the program with KenSharpe called the Phoenix Podcast, and we showcase people who have risen from the ashes. Today we have John, who's really risen from the ashes and is shining. He is a governance guru, and we'll remember him for that always. And to you, the youth out there, I say these days, I'm selling hope because I believe in a future. I believe in the future of Zimbabwe. I believe in you. Stay ethically moral. Stay clean. Find a value system that points you to the north, and don't sacrifice it for any short-term gain. Thank you, John, for being on our program today.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Faith, family, business, adventure. This is the Phoenix Podcast with KenSharpe.